All right, we are back with our second half of the second section of our cybercrime course. And I'm going to start this chunk by talking about civil investigations as well, because it's not just law enforcement that does cyber investigations. There is also the civil law system, right? So the criminal law system is obviously headed up by law enforcement and the criminal courts, and they want to send people to prison for breaking laws. With civil investigations, this is, one person or one organization suing another person or organization for money. Essentially, if I work for company A and I hack into company B's computers um, in order to steal proprietary information, I might not only be investigated by law enforcement, but I might also be kind of investigated by the that other company, and then sued. Company B might sue my company, company A, uh, for the financial damages caused by my actions. Um, so one of the problems is that pretty much anybody can call themselves a cyber investigator and try to get hired as a cyber investigator. And there's no real licensing requirement. There's no real training requirement, although there are a lot of kind of common training courses that people do take in order to be more likely to be hired as an investigator. But I'm not aware of, none of them are required by law, right? Many companies have certain requirements. If we're going to hire you as an investigator or a cyber um, you know, as part of our IT department, you need to have this certification and that certification. But none of them are legally required. So there are lots of really good ones out there. Probably the most famous agency that does investigator training is CompTIA. They do lots of different cyber licensing and training. Um, so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend just go on Google and search for what particular area of cyber investigations or cyber um, job you're looking for. Find some really good certification companies and certification exams. Some of them are fairly expensive, unfortunately. But a lot of times, companies, like if you already have a job in cyber investigations, a lot of times your company will pay for you to get an additional certification. Um, but they will definitely help you find new jobs or get promoted in your current job, and just learn the skills that you need in order to both protect your organization and investigate after, if in case the worst happens. Right now, there are lots of organizations that are specifically focused on um, cybercrime and either preventing it or investigating it or just educating people about how to not be victims. Um, and there's way too many to actually list. But just a few of them, a very very small subset. There's IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center. This is an organization that just works to kind of um, compile data about cyber victimization and find out, who's getting victimized and how and what the latest viruses are and what the latest scams are and what the latest everything is. Uh, in order to make sure that people are aware and informed enough about it to protect themselves. All over the world, there's lots of CERTs, cyber something response team, computer emergency response team. That's what it is. Um, and these are groups of that go in and if an organization or a company or a sufficiently powerful person is a victim of a crime, they go out and help investigate, help determine the extent of damage, help protect from future attacks, all those things. And then another one is the WHOA, that's working working hard, something online abuse. Oh, I can't remember what that stands for right now, but it's an organization designed to kind of educate and prevent online abuse, um, bullying, stalking, harassment, etc., etc. Now, switching back to, general investigations, whether it's law enforcement or civil law investigations, one of the big problems, or one of the biggest areas of concern, is when there's an international investigation. If the offender's in one country and the victim is in the United States, it takes a lot of resources to investigate and prosecute that crime. And a lot of times, federal agencies are going to say, look, it's just not worth it for us to do this investigation for lots of reasons. Number one, it's just not enough kind of damage, right? If somebody in Canada breaks into my bank account and steals $500, the FBI is not going to generate a giant international investigation and work with this foreign country and do all this giant process because I lost $500. They're going to say, hey, sucks for you. Hope your insurance covers it. Move on. So there's a damage requirement, an amount of money or an amount of, the seriousness of the crime has to be high enough before any federal agency is going to initiate and engage with and actually follow through with any kind of international investigation. Then, of course, there's political concerns, right? Now, not a lot of political concern between the United States and Canada or the UK or Australia or, lots of Japan, lots of other countries. The United States and those countries are on incredibly good terms. And any sort of international investigation like that isn't going to be that big of a deal politically. But once you start talking about countries that we're not on the friendliest of terms with, anyone from, Iran or China or Russia or, there are lots of countries where even if everything otherwise would say, hey, yes, let's perform this this international investigation in cooperation with this foreign nation's government. A lot of times, if the leaders of the United States and the leaders of that country aren't on the best of terms, that international investigation is just not going to happen, right? Or at least it'll make it kind of more complicated, more difficult, because that political clash, that political unrest, is going to make it at least more difficult, if not altogether impossible. And then, of course, there's always extradition concerns, right? So if we catch somebody who committed a crime in the United States, but they're a foreign national, we want to arrest them and bring them back to the United States for trial. But once again, that's a time-consuming, expensive process. And so again, it's going to really depend on what foreign country we're talking about. If we find somebody, say, in France, it's going to be comparatively easy to extradite them to the United States. But there are countries that we don't have an extradition treaty with. So they're not going, if they arrest somebody in that country for committing a crime against an American citizen, it's going to be either very difficult or even impossible to, keep that person arrested in that country or have them sent here to the United States to face trial. So extradition is a long, complicated process, even in the best of times. So sometimes you can work out a situation where if that person has also committed a crime in their country, they can be arrested and tried and convicted entirely there instead of being extradited to the United States to face justice for the crimes they committed against American citizens. But if you outside of situations like that, if you actually want them to be extradited to the United States, that's a real big process, and it doesn't happen very often for cybercrimes. It has to be a very, very large cybercrime before our country is going to go through the not only the process of an international investigation, but then the additional process of extraditing that person from their country back to this one. Now, there's also a lot of privacy concerns with any kind of cyber investigation. And there's two examples here that show how privacy and security impact law enforcement investigations kind of from two different angles. So the first one on this list is San Bernardino. So many years ago at this point, there was a mass shooting in San Bernardino, California. And a mass shooting doesn't seem like a cyber crime, right? But just as I've been saying in both in this section and previous section, every crime is a cyber crime. And this mass shooter in San Bernardino ended up dying at the end of his violent rampage. But he had a cell phone. It was an Apple iPhone. And it was locked. And it needed a password to be opened. And there's a feature on Apple iPhones where if you get the password wrong, I think it was 10 times or something like that, the phone locks and then can never be opened again. Essentially, it becomes a really fancy, really expensive brick, right? So law enforcement seized this phone from this now dead offender and really wanted to look at the contents of that phone because they thought there might be links to terrorist groups or links to other potential offenders, and they wanted to investigate the contents of that phone in order to to determine whether this person had any co-conspirators, had planned this mass shooting with anybody else. But it was locked, and they didn't want to just try guessing passwords, because if they got it wrong 10 times, they would brick the phone. So they went to the Apple Corporation and said, hey, we have a warrant for the contents of this phone. Can you please unlock it? And Apple said, no. And the US government said, well, you have to. And Apple said, no, we don't. And what was kind of upsetting for me as a cybercrime researcher is that it started going through the court system. So it would have been nice if that process had finished and the US court system had made a final ruling on whether law enforcement can force, a company like Apple to break their own security in order to further an investigation like that with a warrant under the supervision of a judge, of course. But before there was a final disposition of that case, some other company, some third party, figured out a way to break Apple's security, and thus the U.S. government kind of dropped the lawsuit against Apple. So we don't really have an answer as to whether a company like Apple or like Microsoft or like Samsung or whoever can be forced to kind of break through their own device's security in order to help law enforcement with its investigation. And then the second event or second situation I wanted to talk about was Edward Snowden. So this is a very famous case. Most of you have probably heard of it. But Edward Snowden was working for the National Security Agency. And then essentially, the short version is, took a bunch of classified material that he had access to, but was supposed to keep secret, and gave that to the public, kind of violated that classified information. And that, so it's, these two incidents really reflect the question, both legal and moral question, of what information does law enforcement have a right to, and then what information does the public have a right to, and what information, what data, what kind of information can we as citizens keep private, and what can the government keep private from us? So what's allowed to be private, what's allowed to stay private, can vastly impact how law enforcement does its job, what its job even is. Um, so privacy and security and encryption and classified materials and all those things really, especially in the big cases, are going to be a part of any investigation, whether it's a private company investigation, law enforcement investigation, military investigation. And that's something that we don't really have a good answer on, both legally and morally, and probably won't ever. It's probably going to be one of those things that just kind of continues to be in a gray area, with some cases looking like this and some cases looking like that. And the courts are going to have to weigh in at some point on these kind of finer points of where exactly privacy is allowed, what law enforcement's allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, what we're allowed to keep secret, what we're not allowed to keep secret. But anyway, that is the end of section 2. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you in section 3.